My name is Olivia Dawson. I'm 27 years old, and I live in Columbia, Missouri. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would draw up a contract just to be heard. But then again, I never thought my own sister would pretend I didn't exist on one of the most important days of her life. This isn't a story about a petty argument or a small misunderstanding between siblings. It's a story about betrayal, exclusion, and the quiet kind of revenge. The kind that comes wrapped in legal terms and consequences, with a signature at the bottom. You see, some betrayals don't come with yelling or slammed doors. Some come in the form of a baby shower invitation that never arrives. And when that silence hits harder than any insult, you learn how far you're willing to go to make someone realize what they've done. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments, what's your name and where are you watching from? I want to know who's on the other side of this screen, because if you're still here, I know you're someone who's brave enough to sit with the raw truth. This story isn't light, and it definitely isn't easy to tell. But I need to share it, because somewhere out there, someone is going through the same kind of betrayal. And maybe, just maybe, my courage can help them find theirs. Stick with me until the end, and I promise you'll understand why I had to speak now, after all this time. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe that no one deserves to stay silent just to keep the peace. I grew up thinking my sister Madison and I were inseparable. We were only 2 years apart, and for most of our childhood it was always Liv and Maddie. We shared bunk beds, secrets, and late-night dreams. We wore each other's clothes, got in trouble together, and covered for each other when things went wrong. Our parents used to say we were like two branches from the same tree, but somewhere along the way, that tree started splitting, and I didn't notice until it was already too late. The shift wasn't sudden. It was subtle at first, like Madison not calling back right away, or forgetting my birthday one year and pretending it was just because she'd been so busy. I brushed it off. Life happens. People get distracted. But things escalated quickly after she met Tyler. Tyler was charming in a corporate kind of way. Button-down shirts, practiced smile, and a handshake that was a little too firm, like he was always trying to prove something. He came from money, from a family that had expectations, and from the moment he entered our lives, it felt like Madison started editing herself to fit into a world that didn't include me. I wasn't invited to the engagement party. That stung, but I told myself maybe it was an oversight, or maybe Madison didn't want a big crowd. I sent her a gift anyway, a photo album I made of us growing up, something personal, sentimental. I never got a thank you, not even a text. Still, I stayed hopeful. I thought when the wedding came around, surely I'd be part of it, maid of honor even. But no, not even a bridesmaid. I wasn't invited at all. When I asked her why, she said, I just didn't think it would be comfortable for everyone, as if I was a stranger, as if we hadn't once made up dances in the living room and cried on each other's shoulders after breakups. That was a year ago. I spent months trying to convince myself it didn't matter. I tried to forgive, to move on, to bury the bitterness. I focused on work. I'm a freelance graphic designer, and tried to rebuild my own world without her in it. But it's hard to ignore a wound that never stops bleeding. Then, 2 months ago, I found out through a Facebook post that Madison was pregnant. A baby I would have loved like my own, a niece or nephew I might never meet. The post was filled with happy comments and heart emojis, people gushing over her glow, asking about names, shower dates, nursery themes. Madison looked radiant, I'll admit that. She wore a long white maternity dress and stood next to Tyler in front of a golden balloon arch. They looked like something out of a magazine, perfect, polished, and completely unreachable. I didn't cry, not right away, but I felt something inside me collapse. 2 weeks later, my mother called. You know Madison's having a baby shower next month, she said in that hesitant tone people use when they know they're about to break your heart. She said she's keeping it small, just close friends, and Tyler's family. I remember the silence between us, how loud it felt, how my mother's breathing seemed to echo through the phone. She's your sister, she added softly. No, she was my sister. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a blank document. Not for a letter, not for a plea, but for something else. Something colder, more exact, a contract. Because if Madison wanted to treat our relationship like a formality, then I'd give her one. You see, 2 years ago, I lent Madison $12,000. She was still finishing grad school, between jobs, struggling with rent. Tyler wasn't in the picture yet. She said she'd pay me back within a year. No paperwork, just a promise. Because who needs a contract with their own sister, right? I never saw a cent. But I kept the bank transfer receipt, the emails, the messages, the proof. And now, sitting alone with her baby shower pictures burning holes in my chest, I realized something. Maybe she didn't owe me an invitation. Maybe she didn't even owe me love. But she owed me money, and that was something I could demand. So I wrote it up, a formal repayment demand. No threats, just cold, impersonal terms. I added a clause stating that if the amount wasn't repaid within 60 days, I'd file in small claims court. I knew it would embarrass her. I knew it would stir things up, but I also knew she wouldn't ignore it. Not this. I printed it out, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it by certified mail. It arrived 3 days before her baby shower. I don't know what I expected. A phone call, maybe, an apology, or even fury. What I got was silence, until the day of the shower. That Saturday, I stayed off social media. I didn't want to see more pictures, more laughter that I wasn't part of. But around 4 p.m., I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "You're unbelievable." No name, no punctuation, just those 2 words. And then another, "Don't ever contact me again." That one I knew was Madison. I stared at the screen, fingers trembling, heart pounding. Not because I was scared, but because for the first time in years, she couldn't just ignore me. She had to acknowledge me, even in anger, and something about that felt like power. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and sat on my porch, the Missouri summer air thick with heat. The street was quiet, neighbors watering lawns, kids riding bikes, normalcy. And me? I was the sister who sent a contract to a baby shower. Maybe that makes me cruel. Maybe it makes me bitter. Or maybe it makes me someone who finally stopped being invisible. But this story doesn't end here. Because what happened after that message, what happened in the days and weeks that followed, would change everything. Not just between me and Madison, but within me. Because revenge isn't always about hurting someone back. Sometimes it's about reclaiming the part of yourself they tried to erase. And I was just getting started. The days after Madison's text were strangely quiet, almost eerily so. I expected a follow-up from my mother, maybe a guilt-laced voicemail or a thinly veiled lecture disguised as concern. But no one called. No one asked me what had happened or why. It was like the baby shower came and went, and with it, whatever remained of my place in Madison's world was swept away without ceremony. In a sense, that silence was confirmation of what I'd long suspected. I was no longer considered family. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. But that contract I sent? That was real. That was undeniable. It existed outside of feelings, outside of assumptions or years of shared history. It was black and white. Tangible. A reminder that even the most curated lives on social media can be touched by something inconvenient. Something raw. I had mailed it with no intention of bluffing. The due date was set. 60 days. I gave her time, just enough to twist the knife slowly. I tried to go on with my life as normally as possible, but normal didn't come easy. I found myself replaying conversations in my head, trying to pinpoint the exact moment Madison had turned away from me. Was it something I said? Something I didn't? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many small betrayals I had ignored. Times she canceled plans last minute, left my messages on read, borrowed things, and never returned them. It was like I had been living in a story I'd written for us, and only now was I realizing she had torn out the last chapter and rewritten it without me. I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Gina. She was in her 40s, wore thick glasses, and always had a mug of something herbal in her hand. She didn't say much at first. She let me talk, let me vent, let me unravel years of being the understanding sister. I remember telling her once, "I think Madison believes she's better than me now, like I'm some messy reminder of a life she's outgrown." Gina just nodded and said, "And how does that make you feel?" I laughed bitterly. Like I'm trash she's trying to throw away. But Gina helped me see something I hadn't before. That my pain wasn't just about the baby shower. It was about everything that had been building up: loss, resentment, abandonment. She told me it was okay to grieve the living, to mourn the relationship even if the person was still alive. That hit me like a punch to the chest. Meanwhile, Madison didn't respond to the contract. No email, no call, no offer to repay. I knew she had received it. The delivery confirmation had come through 2 days after I sent it. But she was choosing to ignore it, hoping maybe I'd forget, or maybe that I didn't have the guts to follow through. But she didn't know who I had become in her absence. I started researching small claims court procedures in Missouri, printed forms, deadlines, requirements. It wasn't that I needed the money. I had survived without it for over a year, but it was about the principle, about taking back control. I filed the case on a Tuesday morning, walked into the courthouse in a blazer I hadn't worn since college, hands steady, heart pounding. It felt surreal, like I was stepping into a version of my life where I no longer played the role of the quiet, forgotten one. The court date was set for 6 weeks later. During that time, word began to spread. Not publicly, not on social media, but through whispers. My cousin Lily texted me out of the blue. "Did you really sue Madison?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to explain myself to someone who hadn't reached out in years, but the ripples had begun, and for the first time, I wasn't ashamed. One night, about 3 weeks before the hearing, I received a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Tyler. He didn't introduce himself. He just started talking. "What do you want, Olivia?" His tone was clipped, annoyed, like I was a fly buzzing in his perfect little world. I kept my voice even. "I want what I'm owed." "You're really going to drag this into court over a misunderstanding?" "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a loan. There's proof. She's pregnant, for God's sake. Do you really think this is the time to pull this kind of stunt?" I could almost hear the smirk in his voice, like he thought I'd crumble if he threw guilt at me. "This isn't a stunt," I said calmly. "It's accountability." He paused. I imagined him pinching the bridge of his nose, pacing in his office, annoyed that someone like me, unmarried, self-employed, not part of their country club circles, was causing trouble. "You're not going to win," he said finally. "You know that, right?" "I guess we'll see." Then I hung up. Something about that conversation lit a fire in me. Not because I was scared, but because I saw them clearly now. Two people who had convinced themselves they could rewrite the rules of fairness because of status, timing, or convenience. But I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. In the meantime, I began to write. Not just legal forms or messages, but letters to myself. I poured out every memory of Madison I could recall. The good, the bad, the confusing. I wrote about the time we built a blanket fort in the living room during a thunderstorm, and the time she laughed so hard she cried when I tripped on stage in middle school. I wrote about the late-night phone calls during her college years, when she was lonely and unsure. And I wrote about the slow disappearance, the silence, the pain. It helped me heal in ways I hadn't expected. The night before the court hearing, I barely slept. I went through my folder again and again, checking that everything was in order. The bank transfer receipt, the text messages where she thanked me, the emails where we discussed the loan. I wasn't nervous about facing her. I was nervous about how much of myself I would lose or reclaim in that courtroom. When I arrived the next morning, Madison was already there. She looked tired, her belly prominent beneath a beige dress, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. She didn't look at me when I walked in, didn't acknowledge me at all. The judge called us up, asked us to state our names, and explained the nature of the case. Madison tried to play the sympathy card immediately, mentioning her pregnancy, the stress, the misunderstanding. But the judge didn't care about emotional appeals. He cared about evidence. And my evidence was solid. Madison offered no written proof of repayment, no denial of the transaction, just vague statements about not remembering the terms and thinking it was a gift. When I was given the chance to speak, I kept it simple. I explained the situation, showed the messages, presented the timeline. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just told the truth. The judge ruled in my favor. Madison was ordered to repay the full amount within 30 days or risk a lien against her assets. She still didn't look at me. Outside the courtroom, I stood on the steps and let the summer sun hit my face. People walked past me, indifferent. Cars hummed in the distance. Somewhere across town, there was a nursery being decorated, a life being prepared for, but I wasn't part of that, and I was okay with it, because in that moment, I had taken something back: my voice, my worth, my place in a world that had tried to write me out. I didn't get revenge with venom. I got it with truth, with clarity, with consequences. And it wasn't over yet. 3 days after the hearing, I received a money order in the mail. It wasn't from Madison directly. Of course not. The envelope had no return address, and the handwriting was clearly not hers. But it was the exact amount the court had ordered her to repay. Folded neatly with the money order was a note, typed in bold font with no greeting and no signature. Let this be the last thing between us. I stared at it for a long time, feeling nothing at first. No satisfaction, no triumph, just a kind of numb disbelief that after everything, after years of shared memories, love, and disappointment, that was the sentence she chose to close the book on us. A legal settlement, sealed with silence. For most people, that might have been the end. Payment received. Justice served. Time to move on. But it didn't feel like an ending to me. It felt like a crack just beginning to widen, a quiet shift that would change more than I expected. Because the story hadn't really been about the money. It had always been about power. And now that I had mine back, I wasn't the same Olivia who used to cry into a pillow every time Madison forgot to call. Something in me had hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I went back to therapy, even though the court battle was over. Gina encouraged me to keep writing. Not about Madison this time, but about myself, about what I wanted moving forward, who I was beyond the roles I had played in other people's lives. I wrote pages and pages about identity, worth, boundaries. I realized that for so long I had bent to fit into the spaces other people made for me, especially my sisters. I was always the helper, the cheerleader, the one who kept quiet to keep the peace. But now I was starting to understand the strength in making noise. It was during one of those sessions that Gina asked me a question that hit deeper than anything else she'd said. If Madison wasn't your sister, she asked gently, would you still want her in your life? I didn't answer right away, because the truth is, I wasn't sure. Meanwhile, the repercussions of the court case were still unfolding. Tyler's family, it turned out, didn't appreciate the stain of a public legal matter, no matter how small. I heard through Lily, who, despite everything, had become a kind of reluctant informant, that there was tension between Madison and her in-laws. They don't like the drama, Lily said during one of her increasingly frequent texts. They think it makes them look bad. That almost made me laugh. Look bad? Madison had cut off her only sibling, accepted thousands of dollars with no intention of repayment, excluded me from every major life event, and I was the one making them look bad. But I didn't argue. Let them feel the discomfort of their own choices. I began to receive other messages too, quiet ones, old friends, distant cousins, people who had been watching from afar. I'm proud of you, one read. Took guts to stand up like that. Another said, I had no idea what she did to you. I'm so sorry. I wasn't fishing for validation, but hearing those words felt like air filling a space I hadn't realized was so empty. People had seen, people had noticed, and for once, they were saying something. One message in particular stood out. It came from Madison's old college roommate, Clara. We'd met a few times during holidays and had always gotten along well enough, but we weren't close. Her message was short, but heavy. She's always needed someone to blame. I read it over and over. It made sense. Madison had always struggled with accountability. Growing up, she was the golden child, charming, magnetic, always knowing the right thing to say. When she messed up, someone else usually paid for it. Our parents were quick to excuse her behavior, writing it off as stress, hormones, growing pains. I was the quiet one, the easy daughter, the one who could absorb the damage without breaking. But I wasn't that girl anymore. Then came the turning point, an unexpected invitation. It arrived by email, not from Madison, but from my mother. A soft subject line, family gathering, hope you'll come. Inside, she explained that she was hosting a small brunch at her house. Just immediate family, no big occasion, just a chance to reconnect. She didn't mention Madison, but I knew she'd be there. I read the message 5 times before closing my laptop. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I needed time. Gina and I talked about it for a whole session. Was this a peace offering? A trap? Was I ready to be in the same room with someone who had only recently texted me, "Don't ever contact me again"? What would it mean if I went? What would it mean if I didn't? In the end, I decided I'd go. Not for Madison, not even for my mother, but for me, because avoiding the discomfort meant giving it power, and I was done living like that. I wore a plain blue dress, tied my hair up, and brought a store-bought fruit tart. Nothing dramatic, just enough to say, "I'm here. I'm not hiding." The moment I walked through the front door, I felt it. That electric hum of tension, the kind that makes everyone's smiles a little too wide. My mom hugged me like her life depended on it. My dad gave me a stiff pat on the back and mumbled something about the weather. And Madison? She stood near the kitchen island, hands gently resting on her baby bump, her expression unreadable. For a long time, we didn't speak. I chatted with my uncle about his retirement plans, complimented the egg quiche, smiled for a few obligatory photos. I acted like I belonged there, because I did. And eventually, Madison approached me, slowly, hesitantly. She didn't say hi. She didn't smile. She just stood next to me, eyes fixed on the floor. "So, you got the payment." It wasn't a question. I nodded. I did. Silence stretched between us, thick and fragile. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," she said finally. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. She looked tired. Not just physically, but spiritually. Like someone who had spent so long pretending to be okay that the act was wearing thin. "You didn't leave me much choice." Her jaw tightened. "You embarrassed me." I felt a flicker of heat rise in my chest but forced myself to breathe slowly. "No, you embarrassed yourself. I just stopped covering for you." Her eyes flashed. For a second, I thought she might cry, or yell, or walk away, but she didn't. She stood there, caught between pride and regret, and I realized in that moment, I didn't hate her. I pitied her. "I was going to invite you," she said quietly, "to the baby shower. But Tyler said it would be too complicated. He thought it might cause drama. And you agreed. I thought it was for the best. Was it?" She didn't answer. We stood like that for another minute. Then she turned and walked away. I didn't follow. I didn't press her for more. Because I wasn't there for reconciliation. I was there to remind myself that I had every right to take up space in the room, even if she wished I wouldn't. Later that day, I sat on the porch again, watching the sun dip below the trees. I thought about how far I'd come from that night I first wrote the contract, how much I had changed, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I wasn't the same sister who waited for calls or forgave without apology. Something had shifted, permanently, and Madison knew it now too. The months that followed passed with a quiet rhythm. Life didn't explode into something extraordinary, nor did it collapse into chaos. It just kept moving forward, steadily, like the hands on a clock. And for the first time in a long while, I was moving with it. The brunch at my mother's house had been the last time I saw Madison face to face. After that day, we returned to the silent space we'd crafted between us, an empty corridor of unspoken things. But something in me had changed. The power she once had to make me feel small no longer held. I had looked her in the eye, heard her twisted justifications, and felt no need to shrink or apologize for the woman I had become. Therapy continued to be my anchor. Gina helped me explore not only the pain of the past, but the possibility of a future where I wasn't constantly defined by old wounds. She asked me hard questions about my expectations of others, about how much I gave without receiving, about why I had confused love with sacrifice. One session, she said, "You've been surviving on scraps of connection for years. Isn't it time you asked for the whole meal?" I went home that night and cried, not because I was sad, but because I realized how long I had been starving without even noticing. Professionally, things began to shift as well. I started saying yes to bigger projects, charging what I was worth, setting clearer boundaries with clients. My freelance design business had always been steady, but now it was thriving. I took on a branding campaign for a local women's shelter, and for the first time, I felt like my work was part of something meaningful. I wasn't just decorating websites, I was helping others find their voice. And in that process, I found more of mine. In my personal life, I reconnected with people I had once kept at arm's length, friends I had neglected while trying to hold together a relationship with Madison that was never truly mutual. I began hosting small dinners at my apartment, just 4 or 5 people, simple meals, music in the background. We'd talk for hours about books, work, dating, memories. It was ordinary, but it felt sacred, like I was building something stable, brick by brick, relationship by relationship. One evening, Lily came to one of those dinners. She brought a bottle of red wine and a knowing smile, and after everyone else had left, we sat on my couch, legs curled under us, talking in hushed tones like kids at a sleepover. "She's still upset, you know," Lily said, swirling her wine. "Madison, she told our aunt you humiliated her." I raised an eyebrow. "By asking for my money back? By making it public. That's what she's hung up on. She made it public the moment she ignored the agreement." Lily nodded. "I know, but I think she expected you to stay quiet, like always." That made me pause. Because it was true. For most of my life, I had swallowed discomfort for the sake of peace, smiled through dismissals, apologized just to make things easier, but not anymore. "She made her choices," I said. "I made mine." Lily looked at me for a long moment, then said something I hadn't expected. "I wish I had your courage." The room fell silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of something else. Understanding, maybe. Recognition. As fall settled over Columbia, the trees turned shades of amber and gold. The air grew cooler. My favorite season. I found comfort in walks through campus, in pumpkin-scented candles, in the way the wind carried memories through the crisp air. There was a quietness to everything that matched my spirit. But healing is never linear. One morning, I received an unexpected phone call. It was my father. He rarely called unless it was a holiday or he needed help with his computer. His voice was hoarse, tired. "Your sister had the baby," he said. A pause. "It's a girl." I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. "She's healthy. 7 pounds, 10 ounces. They named her Isabel. Isabel, a name we used to whisper about when we were little girls playing house. Madison always said she'd name her first daughter Isabel. "Thanks for letting me know," I said quietly. "She's going through a lot right now. Postpartum stuff. Emotional. I just thought maybe you'd want to know." I didn't ask to speak to her. I didn't send flowers. I just sat there after we hung up, staring at the wall, imagining a tiny baby swaddled in a hospital blanket. A niece I would probably never hold. Later that night, I pulled out the photo album I had made Madison 2 years earlier, the one she never acknowledged. I flipped through each page slowly. Pictures of us as kids in matching dresses, high school graduation, Christmas mornings, a lifetime of shared memories, captured in moments that no longer existed. I closed the album and put it back on the shelf. Some things I had to let go, but not all things. A week later, I started volunteering once a week at the women's shelter, whose branding I had designed. They needed someone to teach a workshop on creative job skills, basic design, resumes, freelancing platforms. It was something I could do without effort, and yet it filled me in ways I hadn't expected. These women had stories, some darker than mine, some familiar in their patterns of being overlooked, dismissed, undervalued. And as I taught them, I felt the slow stitching of my own soul, thread by thread. One of the women, a soft-spoken mother of 2 named Serena, stayed behind after a session one afternoon. "Your story," she said gently. "I heard a little about it. With your sister." I blinked, surprised. "How?" She shrugged. "Someone mentioned it. Your cousin, maybe? I don't know, but it made me think. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who hurt us the most." I nodded. "Yeah." She leaned forward. "But you did something most people wouldn't. You didn't let it break you." That night, I walked home through the cold streets of downtown Columbia, heart aching but full. There's something about being seen that heals in places no doctor could reach. Not seen through filters or fake smiles, but truly seen. And in that moment, I knew I had started something that went beyond family drama or money. I had started reclaiming my story. The next month, I self-published a collection of essays, part memoir, part reflection, part instruction. I called it Terms and Conditions. The cover was simple: white background, black serif font. Inside were pieces of my heart, written with raw honesty. I didn't expect it to become anything big, but within weeks, it began spreading online. Small circles at first, then a few larger platforms picked it up. I started getting emails from readers, women, sisters, even men, saying how they saw themselves in my pages. One email stood out. It came from a woman in Oregon. "I read your book in one sitting," she wrote. "I cried, not because of what you lost, but because of what you claimed. Thank you for reminding me that silence is not always strength." I wept when I read that, because I finally understood. This wasn't just about Madison anymore. It was about every version of me I had silenced to keep the peace. Every younger Olivia who thought love meant being small, invisible, compliant. I had brought her back to life, word by word. And even though I hadn't held Isabel, hadn't seen her tiny fingers or soft cheeks, I had given her something too. The truth. A story she might one day read. A name she might one day ask about. And maybe then she'll understand that silence is not always love, and that sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is speak, even if her voice shakes, even if no one claps, even if it costs her the family that was supposed to love her most. Winter rolled into Missouri quietly that year. There were no early snowfalls, no dramatic ice storms, just a slow graying of the sky and a hush over the city, as leaves gave up their final grip and bare branches stretched out across the skyline like old memories reaching back for something already gone. Columbia felt different somehow, or maybe I did. The air had that kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. It wasn't ominous exactly, but it wasn't peaceful either. It was that tight space between healing and confrontation. The part of the story where nothing appears to be happening, but everything is shifting beneath the surface. The book had taken on a life of its own. Terms and Conditions was no longer just a quiet release on an indie platform. Within 3 months, I had been invited to speak at 2 women's events, featured on a small podcast, and interviewed for a regional magazine focused on mental health and empowerment. My inbox filled with stories, people writing to say, "Me too, thank you. This made me brave." Strangers saw something in my pain that helped them face their own. I never expected it to matter to anyone else, but it did. That realization felt bigger than the courtroom victory, bigger than the contract itself. One afternoon in early January, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a DM, a real, physical letter. The envelope was addressed in Madison's handwriting. I stood at my kitchen counter staring at it like it might explode. I hadn't heard from her in over 3 months. Since the court, since the baby, since brunch. There had been no texts, no phone calls, not even a secondhand update from family. She'd gone radio silent. Until now. I opened it slowly. It wasn't long. A single page. Typed, not handwritten. She had read the book. She didn't say she liked it. She didn't congratulate me. The tone wasn't warm or forgiving or nostalgic. It was cold, formal, like a ceasefire written in legalese. She accused me of exploiting our family for attention, of painting her as a villain, of using Isabel's name to build a platform. She threatened to take legal steps if I ever mentioned her daughter again in print. I read the letter twice, then folded it in half and placed it in a drawer. Not out of fear, out of clarity. This was her response to being held accountable. Not reflection, not remorse. Not curiosity about what had driven me to finally speak after all these years. Only defense, only control. But what Madison failed to understand, even now, was that I didn't need her approval. Not anymore. Still, the letter stirred something I hadn't expected. Anger. Not just at her, but at the way my entire family had tiptoed around her behavior for years. How every conversation was laced with subtle avoidance. How every family event was built around her comfort. How I was always expected to be the one who kept things smooth, quiet, invisible. I called my mother 2 nights later. I didn't bring up the letter, but I asked about Isabel. "She's growing so fast," my mother said with that breathless warmth only new grandparents have. "Beautiful. Smiles all the time. Does she know who I am?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "No," my mother finally said. "Madison doesn't talk about you." That was it. The final thread. I could feel it snap, not with rage or sorrow, but with finality. It wasn't just that I was excluded. It was that I was being erased. I had told my story, and now Madison was trying to tell hers. One where I never existed. One where Isabel would grow up hearing a version of our family that didn't include the aunt who once carried her mother home drunk from a college party, who made her grilled cheese sandwiches at midnight when their parents were fighting, who lent her thousands of dollars when she was broke and scared. She could try to rewrite it, but I still held the truth, and I had the voice to tell it. I began working on a follow-up project. Not a memoir this time, but a collection of narratives from other women who had experienced familial estrangement, betrayal, or silencing. I titled it, The Uninvited. Each story was anonymous unless the author chose otherwise. Each one was raw, honest, unapologetic. I didn't set out to build a movement, but somehow that's what was happening. People needed a place to say, "This happened to me too." People needed permission to stop performing loyalty at the expense of their well-being. And I was creating a space where that was allowed. The day I launched the project's website, I received over 100 submissions in 24 hours. The next day, 200 more. I cried reading them. Not just for the pain they carried, but for the sheer magnitude of it. There were so many of us. People who had been left out, written off, blamed, gaslit, ghosted, exiled. My inbox became a living archive of resilience. And in the middle of it all, I received another message. This time, not from Madison, from Tyler. It came late at night. A short email. No subject line. "I read your book. I think I finally get it." That was it. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't reply. Because what was there to say? Understanding came late, and softly, and still too far removed to undo anything. But it confirmed what I already knew. The truth had reached them. In some way, it had cut through the image they built of themselves. The control they held so tightly was slipping. And even if they never admitted it publicly, they knew. They knew. A few weeks later, I hosted a reading event at a small bookstore downtown. It wasn't flashy. No press. Just folding chairs, string lights, and a microphone. About 40 people showed up. I wore a burgundy sweater and jeans and read 3 pieces from The Uninvited. One woman came up to me afterward with tears in her eyes and said, "You said the words I didn't know I needed to hear." Another woman hugged me and whispered, "My sister did the same thing to me." I thought I was crazy. That night, I walked home beneath the pale glow of street lamps, the wind crisp against my skin. I felt a deep calm in my chest. Not joy, not triumph, something steadier. Liberation. I had turned my wound into a voice, my silence into action, my invisibility into presence. The contract had been the beginning, but this was the climax. Not revenge in the way Madison might have feared. Not destruction, not scandal, but reclamation. A quiet uprising of truth, a rising tide that no amount of denial could hold back. I wasn't just the sister who got left out of a baby shower anymore. I was the woman who wrote her way out of the silence. Spring returned to Columbia with a kind of soft insistence, like the city had been holding its breath all winter and was finally allowed to exhale. Dogwoods bloomed along the sidewalks, the university lawns turned a vivid green again, and I began opening my windows in the morning just to let the breeze in. Life didn't feel heavy anymore. That subtle, constant tension I had carried in my chest like a second heartbeat was gone. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I had stopped trying to fix what never truly belonged to me. I spent more time outdoors, walking trails, sitting in cafes, reconnecting with the version of myself I had forgotten in all those years of trying to earn a place in Madison's world. I had lost a sister, yes, but I had gained something larger, a sense of self that no longer waited for permission to speak, to act, to take up space. I had learned that family could be a source of love, but also of injury, and that sometimes choosing distance is the greatest form of self-respect. The Uninvited grew steadily. Submissions came from all over the country and beyond. Women and men who had found the courage to name their pain through the stories of others. I curated the most impactful pieces into a printed anthology, which we released at a small conference in Kansas City. The event sold out in 3 days. People drove hours to attend. They hugged one another like survivors of the same shipwreck finally meeting on dry land. They looked at each other and said things like, "I thought it was just me," or "No one ever believed me until now." And I watched them with quiet awe, knowing this movement was no longer mine. It belonged to them. One afternoon, a young woman named Elise approached me after a panel. She looked barely 20, nervous, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. She had read both of my books and wanted to thank me, she said, for helping her understand that her mother's abandonment wasn't her fault. She told me she was planning to cut ties officially through legal emancipation and had been terrified until she read my story. I asked if she was sure. She nodded. "My whole life she made me feel like I owed her for being born," Elise said. "But I don't. I'm allowed to leave." Her voice didn't tremble when she said it. That night I sat in my hotel room with the lamp on low and cried, not from sadness but from the overwhelming responsibility of what storytelling could do. We think we're writing to be heard, but sometimes we're writing to free someone else. Back in Colombia, life found a new rhythm. I still worked as a designer, but my days were now split between creative projects and emotional labor I had never anticipated. People reached out regularly asking for advice, for support, for guidance on how to take the first step out of toxic family dynamics. I couldn't always answer everyone, but I tried. And when I couldn't, I referred them to resources I had once needed myself. Through all of this, Madison remained silent. There were no more letters, no emails, no surprise appearances. From what I gathered, she and Tyler had settled into suburban life outside of St. Louis. She posted photos of Isabel occasionally, filtered, curated, glossy slices of motherhood. The baby was growing fast, thick curls, wide eyes, always dressed in delicate pastels. A beautiful child who didn't know I existed. Sometimes I wondered if that would ever change. One afternoon, I received a message request on Instagram, a name I didn't recognize. The profile was private. No followers, no photo, just a simple message. "She's going to ask about you someday." I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if it was Madison or Tyler or someone else altogether. I never responded. Some messages don't need replies. They're just echoes. But the idea stayed with me, that one day, Isabel might be old enough to notice the absence, to question it, to find me maybe, to read, to piece things together. I didn't know if that day would ever come, but if it did, I knew what she'd find. Not bitterness, not revenge, but a record, the truth, laid out in words she could interpret on her own terms. I kept everything: emails, texts, court documents, photos, the original contract, not as ammunition, as documentation, not to hurt Madison, but to protect myself from the narrative I knew she'd eventually try to spin. Because people like her always rewrite the ending. They omit details, blur timelines, soften the impact to protect their own image. But the truth doesn't need to be loud to survive. It just needs to be consistent. There was a quiet kind of power in knowing that. In May, I was invited to speak at a university conference on healing through narrative. The students asked sharp questions, challenged assumptions, debated ethics. One girl raised her hand and asked if I ever regretted going public with my story. "No," I said. "I regret staying quiet for so long." Later, as I walked through the campus, I thought about the younger version of me who once believed that love meant staying small. That family came before self. That forgiveness had to be unconditional. I thought about how many times I had sat by the phone, waiting for Madison to call, to apologize, to remember me, and how that waiting had stolen years from me. But not anymore. I had stopped waiting. One warm evening that summer, I hosted a backyard dinner with a few close friends. We ate grilled vegetables, passed around glasses of wine, laughed under string lights. Someone brought a guitar. There was music, dancing, the kind of effortless joy that feels like a reward you didn't know you earned. At one point, as the sky darkened and the fireflies began to shimmer, I stood back and looked around, not just at the people, but at the feeling. I was surrounded by chosen family, people who saw me, accepted me, stayed even when things got hard, not bound by blood, but by trust. That was when it hit me. Madison had tried to erase me, but she failed, because I had written myself back in, not into her story, into my own. I didn't need her to explain, to apologize, to acknowledge me. I didn't need an invitation to be part of her life anymore. I had built something better, something lasting, and as the stars came out and the music played softly behind me, I realized I had finally reached the part of the story where the pain didn't win, where the silence wasn't suffocating, where the girl who once begged to be loved had become a woman who chose herself without shame. That was my ending, not a perfect one, but an honest one, and for the first time in years, it was enough. 2 years have passed since the day I mailed that contract. 2 years since the courtroom, the book, the letter, the silence. And I often think about how much can change in that amount of time, how a wound that once pulsed in your chest like a second heart can become just a memory, faint and quiet, no longer dictating your every move. My name is no longer associated only with that story. People now know me for the voices I've helped lift, for the platform I built from truth and resilience, for the work that's still growing beyond anything I could have imagined when I first hit publish. Columbia remains home. I could have moved. There were offers, temptations to start fresh in cities with bigger bookstores, louder applause, but there's something about staying rooted that feels right. This town saw me broken, quiet, dismissed, and now it sees me standing, thriving, sure of who I am. There's power in that, in reclaiming space where you were once invisible. I live in a little yellow house on a tree-lined street with a front porch and wind chimes that I still haven't gotten used to. On Sundays, I sit outside with coffee and a notebook, letting the breeze bring whatever thoughts it wants to carry. The garden I started on a whim now blooms with purpose. Lavender, rosemary, daisies that tilt toward the sun like they know something I don't. Life here is simple, but never small. Every day feels deliberate. There's intention in how I move now, in what I allow in who I keep close. Lily still comes by often. Our relationship, once strained by silence and distance, has become something solid and real. We don't talk much about Madison anymore, not because we're avoiding it, but because it no longer defines our conversations. We talk about work, about people we're dating, about what shows we're watching. She's the one who makes sure I don't forget to celebrate the good things, the small victories. She brings cake for no reason. She drags me out dancing when I get too wrapped up in deadlines. She's become a kind of sister I never knew I needed. My parents remain a complicated story. My mother reaches out occasionally. Texts, short calls. She asks how I'm doing, sometimes sends photos of flowers in her yard or recipes she's tried. She never brings up Madison. My father is quieter still, but I sense he's proud in his own way. When the anthology made a bestseller list, he sent a thumbs-up emoji. It made me laugh out loud. I don't expect reconciliation from them anymore. I don't need it. What I needed was to stop bleeding for their comfort. And I have. There's a kind of peace in no longer asking people to be who they're not capable of becoming. The women's collective I helped found with some of the contributors to The Uninvited has grown into something beautiful. We host retreats now, writing workshops, online spaces where people from all walks of life gather to share, process, grow. We call it the quiet rebellion, because that's what healing is sometimes. Not loud, not flashy, just consistent, firm, unrelenting in its refusal to stay broken. Every retreat ends with a ceremony, nothing religious, just a circle, a candle passed from hand to hand, and each person says one thing they're releasing and one thing they're reclaiming. The first time I did it, I said, I'm releasing my need to be chosen by people who never really saw me, and I'm reclaiming my voice. Now I watch others do the same. A mother who was estranged from her daughter. A man who left a toxic marriage and lost his whole friend group in the process. A teenager who was kicked out for being gay. They all stand in that circle and say their truths into the flickering light. And I think, this is what we're here for. This is the real story. As for Madison, I haven't seen her since that brunch. I hear things now and then, through the family pipeline, that she started a blog about motherhood, that she volunteers at Isabel's school, that Tyler's company moved offices. It all sounds like a life, a full one maybe, but it's a life without me in it. and I've made peace with that. I sometimes wonder what she tells Isabel, if she mentions me at all, if my name is said in passing or buried completely. But then I remember what I've built, and I know that one day, if that little girl grows curious, she'll find me. Maybe she'll type my name into a search bar. Maybe she'll pick up a book in a library. Maybe she'll see her own story reflected in the pages and understand something about the world that no bedtime story could teach her. I don't write about Madison anymore. That story has been told. Not to hurt, but to heal. And once it did what it needed to do, I let it rest. I've written fiction now. Essays on grief and resilience and joy. I've explored how we carry generations inside us, how we break cycles, how we learn to love again after betrayal. The words haven't stopped. If anything, they flow more freely now, no longer choked by shame or fear. One day, not long ago, I received an anonymous package. No return address. Inside was a small wooden box. I opened it slowly, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a bracelet, delicate, gold, with one word engraved on it in tiny cursive letters. Olivia. No note, no explanation, just that single piece of jewelry, placed carefully, almost reverently. I stared at it for a long time. I don't know if it was from Madison. I never will. But I smiled as I placed it on my wrist. Not because I took it as an apology, but because even if it was a gesture of recognition, it came too late to matter. I had already given that name its meaning again. I walk differently now. I take up space without apology. I say no without guilt. I show up for myself in ways I once begged others to do for me. I love deeper because my love is no longer tethered to desperation. I am not the woman who mailed a contract to a baby shower. I am the woman who drew a line in the sand and dared to protect her own heart. That story changed my life, but it didn't define it. What defines my life now are the mornings I wake up without dread. The people who call me because they want to, not because they feel obligated. The words I write that make others feel seen. The freedom of being known, even if only by a few, and being loved anyway. So if Isabel ever finds me, I'll tell her this. You were born into a story already unfolding, but you are not bound by its pages. You get to write your own, and so did I. The truth isn't always pretty, but it is always free. And freedom, in the end, is what saved me. That is the legacy I've chosen. That is the ending I wrote for myself. Have you ever been pushed so far by someone you love that you had no choice but to stand up and draw the line? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your strength. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another powerful journey like this one. Send this video to someone who might be struggling to protect their peace. And remember, the quietest acts of self-respect can lead to the loudest transformations. Thank you for listening to my story, and always know, you have the right to speak your truth, even if your voice shakes.